Welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the past between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. As I usually do, I want to begin by thanking each of my patrons for their support. I'm pretty busy just about all the time, and so I can only afford to keep this up with the support of my patrons. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to lend your support so I can keep going and keep increasing quantity and quality of content, including with collaborations with great guests like I'm doing this season, you can head over to patreon.com/AndrewNSnyder. And so many thanks to Aaron, Mark, Ida, William, Jocelyn, Lynn, Art, Other Aaron, Emmy, Ian, Laura, Tony, Barbara, Stash, Paul, Matthew, Don, Clinton, Jamie, Andrew, Harrison, and Patrick. And again, if you would like to support my work and gain access to early and exclusive episodes, head over to patreon.com/AndrewNSnyder. Okay, so today I would like to welcome to the show John Carswell of the Tolkien Road as we discuss Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which along with Leaf by Niggle and Mythopoeia provide a pretty substantial primer to Tolkien's literary philosophy. Since 2015, John Carswell has been exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's writings and philosophy through the Tolkien Road podcast and YouTube channel. He's the author of 2 books on the Middle-earth Legendarium, Tolkien's Requiem and Tolkien's Overture. He lives just outside of Nashville with his wife and co-host Greta and their 3 kids. And as I've said in the past, I'm a longtime listener of the Tolkien Road, and you should be too. And so, without further ado, here's my conversation on fairy stories with John Carswell. All right, John, so welcome to Mythic Mind.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you. And so today we are talking about on fairy stories, but before we do that, I want to ask you a question that I'm sure you've answered a million times. You know, what is your experience, your draw to Tolkien?
Ooh, this could go on for a while. It goes back. My very first experience, I was listening to one of your episodes recently, and you were talking about how you read The Hobbit in middle school, and it's kind of the similar thing for me. I read it in middle school. My dad, I think, forced me to read it one summer because I was probably playing too many video games or something like that. And he was like, "You're going to read this. You're going to do a book report on it." So I remember reading it, being like, "Okay, it's interesting," and writing the book report. I wish I still had that book report, but I didn't really. It didn't grab me like in the way that that Tolkien did later. It wasn't until the films came out in the early 2000s, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, that it grabbed me in such a deep sort of all the way down to the bone marrow way, right? I saw something in those films that made me want to read the books, and so I did. And it's just kind of been a just a fascination and enchantment ever since. I saw something in those stories that that captivated not only my imagination but my soul, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it and figure out where this guy was coming from. And and so I did some master's work probably 15 years ago, and I wrote my thesis on Tolkien, and kind of getting into the heart of this question, like what is it about Tolkien's works? What was he trying to accomplish within his works? And that carried over into creating the Tolkien Road podcast, and so that's been going on since early 2015 at this point. And 300 something episodes in, and a couple of books under my belt, and the fascination just doesn't cease. The man and his vision means so much to me. It's almost like every time I try to put it into words, I can't. I don't do it justice. And it's it's funny because I'll talk to people who kind of aren't necessarily there when it comes to Tolkien, and friends or whoever, and it's like kind of this weird fascination for them. But for people who are into Tolkien, they understand. And it's just like I'm trying, it's like a constant attempt to do justice to the beauty, just this like deep beauty and power, goodness, truth, all these transcendent things within Tolkien's works, trying to find the words to express that, and hopefully invite some people along on the journey, to uncover those things as well and have our lives transformed by what we find in Tolkien's works.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I can sympathize with so much of that, even though, I didn't come to Tolkien until later in life, relatively recently, at least in any meaningful sense. But there really is just an endless supply of meaning there, of truth, goodness, and beauty. I just recently started going through Lord of the Rings again, after now going through, Silmarillion and Great Tales and some other things. And
Mhm.
I mean, it's a new experience each time you revisit this material.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just
It's
so much there.
and it's to do it in the form of a podcast is interesting because it's there's something a little painful about it because it's like trying to do justice to each word of his you read, like as you kind of
Mm-hmm.
explore it and explain it, but there's so much the works are so rich that you just can't. And so, we've done a Silmarillion read through now twice. Um, and every time I'm like, that just wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough, darn it. Like what I do, right? Not the
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien's work, but what I'm doing.
Right.
And it's the same with Lord of the Rings. We did a chapter by chapter read through years ago, which is 60 plus episodes by itself. Some of them are very long chapters, so you have to take more time. And it's the same kind of thing. You feel like you hear Treebeard in the back of your mind being like, don't be hasty, don't be hasty. And it's like, how in the world am I supposed to get through this if I'm not hasty? Because there's so much, but I want to take it like one page at a time and just appreciate it for all of it, all that it is too.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an honor to just do the journey through these works with different people listening and to correspond with folks and to be invited onto other people's
Mm-hmm.
podcasts to talk about it. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, I can definitely sympathize with the kind of overwhelming responsibility of trying to talk about Tolkien, trying to lead others. I mean, I also just recently started reading through the Carpenter biography,
Mm,
and his mind is simply incredible. The way that he was able to grasp, language and literally create worlds out of language, right? Out of philology, which,
yeah.
um, and then, um, we always have this sense of kind of Tolkien imposter syndrome, right? I mentioned this in the last podcast that I did that you always feel like when you're talking about Tolkien, out loud, no matter how long you've been doing it, you feel like there's someone in Quenya making fun of you somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, there's people, I mean, I've been at this since 2015, as I mentioned earlier, but and that's a pretty long time to kind of keep your attention on one writer, one creator like this. But even then, I'm like, there's people who are listeners to our podcast have been for a while, and they've been at this since before I was born.
Mhm.
Like I'm like, that's amazing. And I'm just
Right.
kind of like, there's this thing of like, you always want to be sure to defer to those who have been at it for a lot longer and who really know their stuff. Like, could probably speak the languages with some fluency, um, and and have read every volume of the History of Middle Earth 5 times,
Mhm.
like, know all the details in there. So, yeah, I never can feel like, I've never really felt comfortable calling myself like, a Tolkien expert or anything like that because I know that there are people with much more expertise out there than I have, and B, I'm like, how can anybody truly be, an expert in this man's works? And I don't fault people who use that title necessarily. It's just one that I never quite feel worthy of using for myself. I feel like a Tolkienite. That's the word I look. And then it's like I'm a
Right.
follower of Tolkien. Like I want to learn from him.
Right. And I think one difficulty here is I feel like even Tolkien wouldn't claim to be an expert on Tolkien, right? And that
Oh yeah.
he's constantly kind of learning himself and his own world, and his constant, I mean, his constant revisions and going through his own mind. Like even Tolkien, I think, was humbled by what he was doing.
Yeah, well, and when you read his letter, I know you've been doing a series on his
Mm-hmm.
letters, and even in what we are going to be talking about with on fairy stories and other writings where he talks about his creative process. It's very clear that he does not see himself as like kind of willing these things into existence necessarily, but it's more like he's kind of following something that's an outside inspiration and and documenting what he beholds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like he'll talk about the writing of the Lord of the Rings and and talk about what the process looked like there, and he'll be like, I was just kind of following along the journey with the characters, and I think he talks about Aragorn, Strider, and what he
Mm-hmm.
discovers as Strider, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as Trotter originally, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. And when he was writing Lord of the Rings, he discovers him as Trotter. He just kind of pops up in the story, and that's almost like a turning point because initially this was just kind of like another you know Hobbit adventure. It was just the sequel to it was the new Hobbit
Mm-hmm.
when he began writing it. It was they were like give us a Hobbit sequel. So he begins writing this thing, and then he discovers, he's a little bit of ways into it with the hobbits, and he discovers Trotter, and that kind of starts taking things to a whole new level.
Right. And even Trotter originally was a hobbit, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you're correct in that. Trotter was initially a hobbit, kind of a different sort of hobbit, but a hobbit that they meet along their journey.
Right. What a discovery that is, to find out that your hobbit Trotter is actually Aragorn.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. There's lots of fun little things like that throughout
Yeah.
the legendarium where it's like, oh, did you know that this there's one that's like it's like it's going to come to me probably later in the
Uh-huh.
episode of what I'm trying to think of, but there's a particularly interesting one that comes along that I was commenting on maybe not too long ago on my Twitter feed or something like that. But yeah, there's just all
Yeah.
that's what's so fun is like Tolkien. There's a humility, even in his greatness. There's this deep humility that you see, throughout his life as he grows from, this aspiring, um, kind of aspiring writer, just in terms of his
Mm-hmm.
career, who he wishes he had more time just to devote to these sort of secret vices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he finally, very pretty late in life, really, like has his you know kind of dreams come true. But he never loses perspective on this is not really about my greatness necessarily, even though all of us would be like, well, yeah, it is. Like,
Right.
but he was under no delusion, for himself, and that in itself is like a mark of true greatness in another sense for me.
Right. I mean, just to go ahead and, you know, put it as in as nerdy of a way as I can. Much like Gandalf, just a servant of the secret fire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that um and again, like all of us would be like, Gandalf is this great, a great figure
Mm-hmm.
too, but there's something about Gandalf um that he would not say that about himself. There's the you look at Gandalf and compare him with Saruman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saruman should have been the great one, right? But there's a deep pride
Mm-hmm.
there that gets the best of him, and Gandalf ends up becoming the one who fulfills the role that Saruman was intended
Mm-hmm.
to, and it's in large part because he does not give in to that pride in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he
Right.
faces the same temptation, he
Mm-hmm.
he does face a similar temptation.
Right. And of course, that takes us all the way back to the Einundale, right? The pride versus serving the good.
Hmm.
And,
Absolutely,
uh,
absolutely. I mean, it's just remarkable, isn't it? Like, um, the construct like the construction of the whole legendarium, just how it all weaves together, so perfectly. It's like
mm-hmm.
it makes me wish, and what Tolkien fan doesn't wish this, that he had lived longer so he could have given us more of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things, so many stories that were left untold. But even then, I think within Tolkien's own mind, and this is where it starts to get really mystical, as if it hasn't already been a little mystical. Within Tolkien's own mind, there's this thought that, and this gets to Leaf by Niggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
that perhaps on the other side, right, we're going to find out that the things that we've begun here, the works that we've begun here, however imperfectly, however incomplete, do realize their own completion in some way that we can't even begin to fathom. And
Right.
that's a truly like wonderful, beautiful thought.
It absolutely is. It's so easy to get frustrated by your own mortality, or I suppose the mortality of others, right?
Yes.
In
Yeah.
Tolkien's case, but like you said, what ultimately gives beautiful things meaning is not the temporary and the earthly, but the fact that it is transcendent and eternal and will find fulfillment, right? And that's what makes our at least worthwhile ambitions worthwhile.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's it's one of those it's another one of those topics. And speaking of on fairy stories, not to jump the gun,
No,
but he
please.
gets into that within on fairy at the end of on fairy stories.
Hmm.
Yeah, he
Yeah, and
alludes to that.
so yeah. And so let's go ahead and start talking about on fairy stories, because we could just talk generally about Tolkien forever. Um, and so I know that you have a particular appreciation for this essay, and so I'm just going to start very generally. What is this essay about, and why do you like it so much?
Well, I refer to it just very shorthand as Tolkien's literary manifesto. Um, I think the thing, as I mentioned, when when I became fascinated by Tolkien after the Jackson movies came out, and I read, and so the first Jackson movie comes out 2001. I see it in the theaters. I quickly saw it again for the second time because I loved the first one so much, and then I was like, now I got to wait a year for the next one, so I'm going to go ahead and read the books. And I read them. I probably read them. I think I read them twice in that space. The whole Lord of the Rings before the next one came out, and then kind of started to wonder like, okay, this is the greatest thing I've ever read. What's going on here? And so you start trying to find other works, and so that led me to On Fairy Stories eventually. Um and I think uh On Fairy Stories is not it's not an easy read. Like it's not something that just kind of I will say, to bring up his good friend and fellow inkling C.S. Lewis. Tolkien was not the same kind of writer that Lewis was. Tolkien can be a little frustrating at times in his sort of I, this isn't really the right term, but like wordiness, especially
Mhm.
when he's just writing, he can be a little elliptical. He's a little maybe a little like St. Paul in that way, where it's kind of
Mhm.
like, okay, I can tell you're saying some really amazing things that maybe isn't the most quotable way of saying it, but okay. But you spend time with it and you figure out where he's coming from. But I think you know it's how he rounds it all off, right? It's those last couple of sections that really drive it home, because the next to last before the epilogue, you have the section on recovery, escape, and consolation, where he starts talking about like the emotional and spiritual impact of good fantasy and the role it has to play. And that to me was like, oh wait, because we have in our minds, in the modern world, that fantasy storytelling, it's just kind of this distraction, right? That it really doesn't, it's just something we do to kill time until the end, right? Um, and maybe some of it's better than the others, but it's kind of it's almost like a utilitarian view of fantasy and of storytelling in general, right? Um, but what Tolkien does is he drives it home to have this much greater significance for us as human beings, right? That these are not simply distractions uh, from the dead, ugly truth, right, of our mortality, and that like this nihilistic view of creation and of our reality. That these things have deep meanings and call us to a greater understanding of reality. That there is something real beyond the veil of this world, right? That there is something greater than our reality. Um, he goes through at the end and he talks about recovery. Recovery is the way is this. ability to see things not as they are, but as they are meant to be seen, right? That there's a meaning that transcends what we may think about something, to escape, right? So I love the twist he does on escape, because people who are, creative and things like that will be accused of escapism a lot, right? You're just trying to escape from from your responsibility to reality and these sorts of things. And I love what he does. He turns it on his head and he says, of course we are, right? Like, who wouldn't want to escape from, being falsely imprisoned, right? Like, by some
Right.
tyrant, right? Um, we applaud those when we think about, like, the escape stories of, like, World War II, escaping from the prison camp, or from from a Gestapo holding cell, right? He almost, I think, uses that sort of image there.
Mhm.
And he's like, we applaud those people when they escape, right? But when we want to escape from people who tell us reality is this ugly thing, we are told we're wrong because of it. And just the consolation of the happy ending, right? And then he ties all of that into this notion in the epilogue that um we are inside of the great fairy story, of
Mhm.
the great fantasy tale that's in fact not fantasy at all, right? um we're inside of this story that is the gospel, that is the that culminates in this, and it coins this term eucatastrophe, right? uh in the happy turn, the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. And in that story of the incarnation, there is the happy turn of the crucifixion leading to the resurrection, the passion of Christ. So he rounds it all off by saying, guess what? We live inside a fairy tale. We inhabit a fairy tale. And when I read that, I was like, there it is. That is this man's genius right there. That is his secret fire that he is serving. Um,
Mhm.
and it has just fascinated me and kept me, coming back to this work, referring to this work for years. There's a lot, there's so much wisdom in the, just in regards to, like, literary theory, in the first half of it, leading up to those, final parts, that I just kind of glossed over. But, little notes like, um, his argument that we as moderns want to kind of say, like, oh, fairy tales are these nice cute little things we tell to, to kids, but they don't really have any purpose for adults. And he's like, it's like, no, a good fairy tale, a good fairy story, good fantasy should be oriented towards adults, right? If you orient it towards children, you're not doing a good job, right? um and even just getting into, like, the origins, like, why do we as human beings do these things? Why did ancients, begin telling these tales, going against the notion that you can kind of, like the reductionist attitude that says, like, well, this story is really just this story, right? With some little extra stuff added on. And he's like,
Mhm.
no, it's precisely the details that make it worthwhile, right? It is precisely it's this maximum, like, creative maximalism, right? That instead of this, like, minimalist sort of mindset. Anyway, so I've been droning on about about all of this for a while. But I mean, it's one I just come back to constantly, because
Mhm.
Tolkien gives us I think he unlocks it all for us, and he says, this is where I'm coming from, right? When in all of my work, in all of my stories, in my legendarium, this is where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it's a great overview. And as you pointed out, we really see that his literary philosophy is inseparable from his theology, right? His deepest held philosophy, and so it's all intimately connected. And this is why when you read Tolkien, you understand that something else is going on, right?
Hmm.
And so on one hand, yeah, obviously he's not writing allegory, right? It's not Chronicles of Narnia. However, he's writing out of a deeply held belief that words ultimately have transcendent and eternal significance,
Yeah.
right? And so naturally, his storytelling is going to present that, again, in a very natural way, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so now it's kind of going back to the beginning, hitting on some of those points in a bit more detail. On the most basic level, he's talking about fairy, which he identifies with the perilous realm. Hence the title of this collection that I'm going through. Now, what for Tolkien? What exactly is fairy or the perilous realm? What does that mean?
Yeah. This is where it starts getting it's I think it starts getting a little challenging. We just did an episode on Smith of Wooten Major,
Mm-hmm.
which you'll probably be getting to soon enough.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Smith of Wooten Major is a really, really challenging work for me. Um, but it has to do with that same question. It's essentially this story of this figure who enters into the perilous realm, and what is this? Interestingly enough, Tolkien wrote it towards the end of his life, and it's really the perilous realm is this place that it 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 goes beyond our reality, and there's no easy way of entering into it. Within the story of Smith of Wooten Major, it's like you enter into you enter into the character enters into the woods, and and it's never really clear how he eventually comes to this place, but it almost seems like it kind of coexists with our own world. um you know uh but it seems to it seems to go beyond it. um I think for Tolkien, he himself was always kind of kind of like trying to get at how do I connect it with our own reality. He almost seems to be like it's not just something enter into through a portal or something like that, like through kind of a special a special portal or something like that. But you go off and you decide to go on an adventure, and you enter into this other place. Um,
Right. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
And sorry, go ahead.
no, no, no. It looked like you were about to say something, so I was gonna I was gonna let you say something.
Yeah, so I was going to say that kind of on that line of it almost blends into some level of our reality, right? It's not in an entirely separate place. It's sort of something that we've happened to on occasion. Um, Now, in the last episode that I did on Leaf by Niggle, at one point I tried to identify fairy as something like the transcendent, but then I was rereading on fairy stories, and I feel like I got that wrong because he says specifically, right near the beginning, he says that um, we shouldn't so much identify fairies as supernatural, right?
Mhm.
Supernatural is actually something more applies to us as men, right? As humans in this world.
Right. Yep.
And so he almost identifies the world of fairy almost with the hypernatural.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know on that episode, not your Leaf by Niggle episode, but the one
Mm-hmm.
you might have used this term in the Leaf by Niggle too, but you talked about good fiction being hyper real, and
Right.
there is that sense in like it's fairy is not so much a place to which we go like we would go just anywhere else, but it's a widening of the vision to see the greater reality that's in play. Now that's extremely hard to put into any kind of writing, and so Tolkien, I think, even within the development of his own legendarium, kind of had evolving thoughts on that over on how to depict that throughout the course of his life, as he was creating this legendarium. Um, I mean, I think at the very beginning of On Fairy Stories, if I can read this quote, I think this is
Mm-hmm.
pretty good on that. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys be lost. I mean, and that's, we're both stumbling over trying to put it into words ourselves right here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there it is, right? Its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. Our imaginations are certainly involved in it, but that doesn't make it less real. It's almost as if we glimpse, and you know, for me reading, so my first foray into on fairy stories was through this Tree and Leaf.
Hmm.
Um, and in Tree and Leaf was originally published as on fairy stories and Leaf by Niggle together. It's been expanded to include Mythopoeia and the Homecoming of Beartnoth. Um, Mythopoeia is almost, I would argue, reading Mythopoeia along with on fairy stories. It's like reading Mythopoeia actually helps you like kind of is a more succinct way of it's like a poetic succinct summary directed at C.S. Lewis,
Hmm.
a younger C.S. Lewis, about fantasy, about storytelling. And so it really gets to this idea that like the this realm of fairy is not this unreal imaginative place, but it is a hyper real imaginative place. It's the place our imaginations take us that pull us out of the mundane and allow us to see reality as it was meant to be seen.
Right. And I think that this actually ties into some of the existentialist Kierkegaardian directions that I'm going in, other projects. Right. He says you go into this realm as something that you can't really describe to others. It's kind of simply something that you experience, firsthand.
Hmm.
Um, and he says just a couple pages after that, the road to fairyland, it's not the road to heaven or to hell. It's something in between. It's almost like it's the realm where we come to most perceive kind of who we are, what reality is, and what decisions we have to make in order to define our direction. Right?
Abs-
It's
abs-
Yeah, it's that
Absolutely.
most fundamental realm of being. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a heal. I 100% believe that I have been very deeply healed from a lot of things through Tolkien's stories. Um, and you know, even there, I'd struck, and the kinds of things they are like deep psychological things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still, still challenged by them, and still being healed. Sometimes realizations come to me, and it's like, it stings a little, right? But it's the kind of sting that says like, hey, this is work you need to do. Um, but it does, it can put the most mundane things into a greater perspective. uh in both of our cases, we're fathers, and just the notion of raising children can seem like a very mundane thing, something at
Mm-hmm.
times people are often tempted in their parenthood to think like, oh, I have other things I'd rather attend to than my kids, and especially when they're young. But to be able uh to view that role, and to view that role in a greater way, perhaps as and again, this is where somebody listening in might think it sounds a little corny, but there's real truth to this. Viewing it as, Gandalf might view his role, or viewing it as Aragorn might view his role, right, in this heroic way. Viewing it as Frodo might view his role in bearing the ring, right, when it's particularly difficult. um that these are worthwhile duties, worthwhile missions, uh, and to undertake them is to is to fulfill something much greater than maybe we realize in the moment.
Yeah, and especially in Tolkien's case, right? All the real heroes ultimately are servants, right?
Hmm.
Usually doing what seems like a relatively small task at the time in order to accomplish something much greater. And obviously that translates into parenthood, into being a good spouse, or various arenas of life, right? It's that humble service, simply doing the task directly in front of us, that's so common in Tolkien's life and is ultimately what we're called to in the primary world. And so, yeah, absolutely. I've for a while now, I've said that you Narnia is good for evangelism. Tolkien's good for discipleship.
That's great. I love that. That's I'd never heard it put that way, but I think that's 100% correct. Uh, and I mean, in my own case, just to give a little, to give credit where credit's due. um, my dad most definitely evangelized me at a young age through the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I mean, he explained the
Mm-hmm.
gospel to me through the story of Aslan, and I know it's at this point it's a It's almost a cliche for people to say that, but like, but it was very true for me. I remember it as clear as day when I was still very young, really understanding the story of the gospel through the story of Aslan, and
Hmm.
and so credit where credit's due on that front. But
Yeah.
yeah, but then now, having been a Christian for so long, and I still love C.S. Lewis, absolutely,
Hmm. Yeah.
but my fascination, having been a Christian for a long time and having to deal with all the discipleship questions that come,
Hmm.
being a follower of Christ for a long time, going into that, Tolkien informs me a lot more on that nowadays
Hmm.
than perhaps C.S. Lewis does. Although C.S. Lewis still informs me a good bit.
Of
So
course, of course.
yeah.
All right, let's. Now he does say that so this world of fairy, it also includes mortal men when they are enchanted.
Hmm.
Now, can you talk to a little bit about what Tolkien means by enchantment?
Yeah. This is another really wonderful idea of Tolkien. So when he's talking about fantasy and what makes for good fantasy, uh, in the later parts of On Fairy Stories, he uses this term enchantment over and against suspension of disbelief. And I think this is such a amazing insight. It- what he's getting at is that if your readers, or you can apply this to just about any form of art, but
Mhm.
if a person is beholding your work of art, we'll just stick with reading. But if your readers, the people listening to your tale, have to perform this function of suspension of disbelief, right? They have to kind of be like, okay, I guess I'll play along. Um, then it's not really good fantasy, right? It's not really doing the job that fantasy should be doing. Good fantasy for Tolkien, it does this thing called enchantment. It's so well told, so well depicted that we don't have to suspend disbelief. We are simply enchanted by the story and forget the whole idea of belief in the first place, right? It's like it seems real. And that to me was something else that drew me to Tolkien uh early on was, man, this just seems like this real place, you know. Middle Earth seemed completely real, as if it was our own place, as if it
Mhm.
was a place you could just go and travel to, right? Um, and it didn't seem like a place you'd have to enter through a portal, like through
Mhm.
through a wardrobe or something like that.
Right.
You could just go there, and or maybe it doesn't exist, in the same way now. But if you had existed, you know, 10,000 years ago, or however, whatever number,
Mhm.
then you would have been there, right?
Mhm.
And so that's like the standard, the creative standard, if you will, the aesthetic standard that Tolkien held himself to. It's this sense of verisimilitude, right? That the art is so well done that it just simply seems real. If it was depicting something that is real on our plane as well.
Right. And I think it's helpful to kind of look at how this idea of enchantment kind of takes place, within the legendarium. You consider like the sort of elven magic of sorts, which ultimately is not manipulation. It's the idea of bringing out the reality that's already there, right?
Hmm.
Simply on a often hidden, veiled level. Um, and I think ultimately that's what Tolkien's idea of enchantment is. That it's not a way to magically manipulate his readers. It's a way to, as you said, to kind of bring them into a reality that actually exists. It's almost to bring out the hidden qualities of the reader, right? That's kind of what enchantment is in the right sense, as opposed to a bad story, which will have an effect on the reader, but usually one of more manipulation. This is the difference between you know Gandalf, whose task is to kindle the hearts of men, right? Inspire and bring out the good that is ultimately there on some level, versus the Saruman, who is more of the industrialist magician trying to recreate the world in his image, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's an absolutely key insight as well. Um, for Tolkien, it was very like the elves play a very important function. See, I hate even talking in those terms when it comes to Tolkien, because it's like they don't play a function. They're this integral
But they
thing
are
in
who they are, right?
his story,
Right.
um, because he wasn't doing this thing where like, let me tell you the story. Here's good guys, here's bad guys. He was. It was just this completely like organic process. Trying to like harness some of what he felt kind of flowing through him. um and the elves in that way they depict something of that. The elves look at the world and they want to develop the nature of a thing. They have insight into the nature of a thing and what it could be, right? There's that question of like what it's intended to be. And so they will look at a tree and they won't think, "Oh, well, that looks like it would be good for chopping down and turning into firewood." Caveman, caveman think, "Want me stay warm," right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the elf looks at that and they're like, "We can nurture these trees to, being these great things, and then we can, build Lothlorien there, right?
Mm-hmm.
This kingdom that really respects the nature around us, but almost looks supernatural in a way, right? Like or hypernatural, whatever, however we want to term it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a beautification and a development of the natural realm that has deep respect for the natural realm, but develops it further. And so it kind of goes against this idea that like we just need to leave nature alone and not do anything with it. But it also goes against this kind of counterpoint idea, which is that we need to manipulate nature. We need to we can use nature for what to and kind of violate it as we see fit in the name of progress and technology, right? And magic, that word is such an interesting word for Tolkien, because people think fantasy and that's probably the first word they think of
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of the genre is like is magic. And for Tolkien that word is a bad word. There was the biopic that came out a few years ago about Tolkien. There's a scene in there, and not to get into any of my thoughts on that movie necessarily, but there's a scene in there that drove me crazy because at one point he tells, the young Tolkien tells Edith, something along the line. It's something kind of corny, but it's like, "Oh, you make me feel magical," or something like this. And I'm like, no, Tolkien would not have said that, right? Or at least he may have said
Mm-hmm.
that then, but that's not true to like who he was, right? And how he
Right.
would have
Right.
understood that term. Because for Tolkien, magic is the same thing as sort of like you use the term the industrialist, like how can I manipulate reality through my wisdom, right? Through my kind of
Mm-hmm.
like calculation and wisdom in order to achieve these kind of great things that will make me powerful, right? Um, Instead of having a humility towards nature and respect of how it should properly be used.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I know Tolkien even makes the point that if Gandalf were to get the ring and become ring lord, right, he would essentially be um, worse than Sauron, right? Because he would be trying to order the world in a righteous way, but ultimately in a self-referential, self-righteous way, right? And
Yeah.
so that would be the turn from the Gandalf we know, the servant of the secret fire, to the manipulator trying to kind of bring everything into his vision of how the world should be. And I think that right there is a good contrast in magic versus enchantment.
Absolutely, yeah, and the ring is kind of the primary, the One Ring, Sauron's ring is the kind of primary work of Sauron that depicts this because um, and it's really interesting because he leverages the wisdom and the peculiar like kind of insight and gift of the elves, right? Their particular sort of insight into nature, and he leverages that to his own ends, right? To create the One Ring, which is the ruling ring. And this idea of the ruling ring is just it's so applicable in so many ways. But it's this concept of creating a technology um, that binds together, that makes one super powerful, but also grants one the ability to control, right? To control others,
Mm-hmm.
to have domination over others.
Mm-hmm. Right. I feel like I could go in that direction for a while now, but to kind of bring it back toward the end of on fairy stories, you mentioned the idea of the gospel ultimately being a fairy story. Now, obviously, that kind of makes sense in light of everything we've discussed. But most people, right? You hear the gospel's a fairy story, suddenly you sound like an atheist, right?
Right.
So, can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it is a fun there. Yeah, there's these little it's just like with scripture, right? You can pull little things out of scripture, that if you pull them out of context, they sound like they mean the opposite of what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tolkien, I'm trying to think, does he ever actually say the? Let me pull up the exact quote because I think it's worthwhile to read this exactly as he says
Yeah.
it. Um, I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting into this aspect, as to others, of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. So if you just take that line right
Mm-hmm.
there, and you're like Tolkien, it's like you think of it in like modern like newspaper terms or something like that, like Tolkien Gospels contain a fairy story, like dun
Right.
dun
Right.
dun, right? And then all the like hot takes happen on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you commentators left and right have their own way in on that. Um, no, if you have to read the whole thing of what Tolkien was getting at before, when you see that for him fairy tales are not untrue things, that they're truths that go beyond our reality, then it starts to make sense what he's getting at. But I'll
Right.
continue on. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history in the primary world. This desire, or the desire and aspiration of subcreation, has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. So, I mean, just an incredible quote. I mean, you could do probably several episodes on
Mm-hmm.
that one paragraph right there. But um, so, but just to kind of summarize and get back to your question, what does
Mm-hmm.
he mean by that? Well, he's saying that um, we we are not wrong to view our own reality as part of a greater story, right? As part of a story that transcends whatever we might be going through day to day. Just like Frodo found himself raised up into this great story all of a sudden after years living in the Shire, right? Kind of mundane Shire life, right? Maybe listening to some of, Uncle Bilbo's tales. He finds himself raised up, and all of a sudden he's undergoing this incredible trial himself, right? For the sake of certainly not only himself, but for the really the world at large, for all the free peoples of Middle Earth. Um, in the same way, that's the truth of our lives, that we exist day to day in this world where there's so much going on, both in kind of the if we were there, we'd see it going on sense, but also in the transcending what we can see, what we can behold by the senses sort of realm. Um, and he's saying that that's the gospel, right? That we live in this world where the gospel uh, has has entered into history, right? God Himself has entered into history. That's why He calls the incarnation the chief catastrophe of man's
Mm-hmm.
story, right? Um, as Christians, we believe that absolutely Christ was a historical figure, and that the Gospels themselves are historical writings, right? That they depict historical events, things that actually happened. If you went back in time and you saw those things, if you were
Mm-hmm.
in those places at those times, you would see them happening, right? You would see them happening with your own eyes. But that even in those things, there's a deeper reality going on, and the Gospels give us that, right? They show us the things that were going on behind the scenes, as it were. Um, so yeah, this this is just one of those things where you can I mean, it's just it's a fascinating concept. But knowing that our own story is part of the same history that the gospel story is a part of, raises our individual stories up into the gospel story as well.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
we're inside of a great fairy tale.
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, C.S. Lewis says later on, right? The gospel is myth become fact, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It is the ultimate story come true in historical fact. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this was this was an idea, with Lewis and Tolkien, like with these on fairy stories, Mythopoeia, um, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, uh, you when you read Lewis kind of next to Tolkien, you realize just how deep the influence these two,
Mm-hmm.
just how deep their influence was on each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially for a particular period in time that was very important for both of them. They had a deep influence on one another. And beautiful little snippet of what what true
Mm-hmm.
friendship can mean for two people.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, I think we've covered a lot of material. Do you have anything else to kind of leave us with, or any other parting words?
I so I just hope I hope people find this inspiring. I hope people will pick up on fairy
Mm-hmm.
stories and read it for themselves. As challenging as is it's like all of Tolkien's other works. It's kind of initially it's a little challenging, but it's worth it. It is 100% worth it, and it's for many it's life transforming, right? To take to do the work necessary to make it through. I would
Yeah.
also I don't know if you plan, because I know you're going through the Tales from the Perilous Realm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you plan to cover Mythopoeia at any point, but I would highly recommend folks read Mythopoeia.
Mm-hmm.
It is like I said, in Tree and Leaf, it follows right after on Fairy Stories. It's a pretty short read because it's basically a 6-page long poem, but it is directed from Tolkien. He doesn't say it's directed to Lewis, but we know it's directed to Lewis when Lewis was not yet a believer. And it's a beautiful I'd say it captures in poetic form a lot of what Tolkien is getting
Mm-hmm.
at in On Fairy Stories as well. So it's a great companion to read side by side with On Fairy Stories as well. Um, and uh, and then I'll just say if I will just say if you didn't listen to Andrew's episode on Leaf by Niggle, then you need to go back and do that, because
Mm-hmm.
Leaf by Niggle is I think where it the these three things go together, just in my mind, and maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
because I first experienced them together here. But Leaf by Niggle on Fairy Stories is the manifesto, the literary manifesto for Tolkien. Mythopoeia is the dialogue with somebody who disagrees with him, and Leaf by Niggle is the inspired vision of what Tolkien was getting at throughout his life. And it's a story that like has this application to, I think, each and every one of us, that puts our lives in perspective, um in a way that maybe no other story I've ever read does. So so
Yeah.
go and listen to Andrew's episode on Leaf by Niggle for sure.
All right. Yeah, that was a good summary, bringing all that together. To echo some of what you just said, I teach a course in Christian worldview, and in the section on storytelling, literature, and whatnot, I have them read on fairy stories. And yeah, when they tell me that by the end they were starting to get some idea as to what he was saying, I'm happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely it's worth the slog through for that first read. I also like that you called it a manifesto, because it's definitely something that radicalized my thinking, and
Yeah.
manifestos and radicalization definitely go hand in hand. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And one other quick note, and sorry
yeah,
not to draw it.
no, please.
It's just one of those things where I can kind of get going. It's really interesting that Tolkien on Fairy Stories is a in its conception came about just as he, like during the time, so just as The Hobbit was becoming kind of a sensation in its own time, but before he wrote The Lord of the Rings. So it's really interesting too, just to kind of see his own developing thought. He had been creating Middle Earth for the Legendarium for about 20 years at that point, but he was just figuring out how to bring the Hobbit into that world. Um, and so it's really fascinating too, just to understand how his thinking developed between the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, because you can see in the Hobbit he's almost rebuking himself a couple of times on fairy stories because of there's parts of the Hobbit where he gets a little too winky with the kids, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's like he falls into that trap of telling fairy tales that then he goes on and on fairy stories to say, don't do this, don't wink at the kids, when you're telling your stories, right? Tell the story as if you're telling it as if it were real, and telling it to an adult, and the kids will follow suit, and that's absolutely
Right.
true. There's so many kids who read Lord of the Rings at a much younger age than I did and are just fascinated by it.
Right, absolutely. Though I will say, I do still appreciate in Lord of the Rings in the Fellowship that one fox, right, who has that thought.
Yeah.
um,
No, I mean, yeah, it's well, and it's not like Tolkien ever became I mean, even a character like Tom Bombadil can be
mhm, mhm,
can seem like he's just this weird little fairy tale character. But then you understand more deeply what Tolkien was doing there,
mhm.
and you realize that it's actually there's much more there than you realized.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's that's part of the fun of Tolkien to me, is like he
Mhm.
does have those little things, those little one-off references that are just kind of like, what's going on with that? But
Right.
even the fox, right? The fox, and I know the reference you're referring to. It's been a while since
Mhm.
I laid eyes on it. But what is he kind of mentions the fox?
Like, it's weird seeing hobbits in this area,
That's right.
but he
He kind
never
of
finds out anything else about it.
he goes inside the fox's head for a minute when he sees the
Right.
hobbits, right? Um, One of the things in On Fairy Stories is he mentions that we have that most humans have this desire to be able to speak with animals, right? To
Mhm.
understand the mind of
Yeah.
animals, right? So even that plays into
Mhm.
uh, you know what we're seeing here, and it also plays into this idea of like respect for nature. So it's just
Mhm.
Tolkien had a mind like none other I've been able to find. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just in a mind that I truly love and admire.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, John. This is a good conversation, and I definitely appreciate you coming on.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
Got it. Yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope that you did too. Before the season's over, I'm definitely going to need to loop back around and spend some time with Mythopoeia to round out what we've discussed here. In the next episode, I'll be discussing Tom Bombadil with C.R. Wiley, author of the book In the House of Tom Bombadil. Tales from the Perilous Realm, which we're working through now, contains the collection of poems titled The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and so I thought that this conversation would be a worthwhile tie-in. I recorded this conversation right after speaking with John, and so I'm releasing them simultaneously on Patreon. And so, regardless of where you're listening to this right now, you can go ahead and find my conversation with C.R. Wiley if you are a patron. And if you aren't, this is a great time to join. Go ahead and head over to patreon.com/AndrewNSnyder to support my work and to gain exclusive access. And I leave you now with the final paragraph of On Fairy Stories. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy, still go on, and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian still has to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated, that he may now, perhaps, fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed. They may be as like and as unlike the forms that we now give them as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. That's it for now. and I wish you meaningful trails ahead.